It's on. Hi, good morning. Good morning. Hi. So I'm glad you made it in this treacherous weather. Today is our first guest lecture, first in a list of illustrious, experienced, and thoughtful lecturers. The reason I invited Dr. Danielle Kennedy to this class to talk to us about coaching is because she has the unique combination of being an expert practitioner, having worked in executive coaching for a long time, having worked with senior executives from top organizations throughout the country. And what she also brings is a very deep understanding and thinking about the topic, which very much is in line with our approach in this course, the combination of action and reflection. So Dr. Danielle Kennedy is going to give us the introductory lecture to coaching. I'm going to build on that in the next lecture. And as you know, coaching, and your being a coachee is a central part, probably the central part of this course. It's what will ultimately help us in our leadership development. So it's a great honor to have Danielle Kennedy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tal. I think the first order of business is for me to feel some kind of presence here, be present here. And I want to be with you and spend the next 45 minutes as productively as possible. But in order to do that, I want to say something about the fact that I was about Professor Stone, whose presence I feel here very much. I wouldn't be here, actually. He introduced me to Tal. And he was a close personal friend and a mentor and inspirer, and I just feel like you guys should know that about me so that I can be here with you. The other thing I want to say right off the bat is that I am a practitioner. I don't teach leadership. I don't do much studying about it, but I do a lot of practicing of leadership, and it's been a passionate interest of mine most of my career. So this part is going to be the theory in action, not the theory so much. What we're going to do today is focus on leadership development as it's expressed in executive coaching. I'm going to describe the field, tell you something about the process, and some of the core techniques that I use in my work. I'm not sure there are all kinds of executive coaches. People are using all sorts of different methodologies today. I will tell you a little bit about the methodology that I use, and then if we have time, I'd like to show you a case example or tell you a little bit about the specifics of it. Now, one of the big issues about leadership development is it really different from human development? If one is a fully developed human being, is it possible to be a better leader? And I don't really know the answer to that question. I haven't had a whole lot of luck differentiating human development from leadership development. I myself draw on a psychodynamic model and a developmental model, a developmental cognitive model. I started out, maybe the psychodynamic model you all know is psychoanalytic, Freud, and object relations theory, clinical developmental theory. And then cognitive development, I tend to use the model by Bob Keegan, who talks about subject-object balance and how each of us, through the course of our lives as we develop, become increasingly capable of moving our perspective farther and farther and farther away, and our capacity to observe ourselves in a situation. Started out as a social worker, and my first job, sort of bottom of the barrel, entry-level job in social work, is child welfare. I mean, it's sad but true. It should be probably one of the top-level jobs, but initially it was my job to help keep children at risk alive. So what I found myself doing was helping their mothers lead their lives, trying to help their mothers lead their own lives so that they could provide some containment, some leadership for their own child. So I like to think about the progression from leading one's own life to leading one's family, to leading tasks and projects, teams, organizations, conglomerates, causes, nations. I see it as an ever-expanding circle where if one actually has the capacity to be in charge of oneself, your capacity to be a leader is enhanced. Okay, I want to differentiate off the bat between managing and leading. Executive coaches actually provide help in both of these domains. I differentiate them by thinking of managers doing technical work, and technical work as defined as the sort of work that you do when you know what the answer is, when you know what is supposed to happen, when you know the technology. So it's getting people to also learn the technology and getting them to use it efficiently. Where I see leadership as adaptive work. Leadership is when we don't know the answer, and our job is to lead some kind of process, problem-solving process, toward developing an answer, finding an answer, innovating an answer to problems. So here we have the leadership life cycle, and coaches tend to get engaged around the transitions between these proficiencies. First, there's the star performer, the individual performer who is in charge of him or herself. Next, moving to manager, who's somebody who can, I remember my first job as manager was night manager at the Village Dairy. And I was in charge of myself and the cleanup person and the keys to the place at night. It was something I learned how to master, and there were answers to that. But then the big transition where I think a lot of coaches spend most of their time is this one here between manager and leader, because of course that's where one has to leave the page and enter into a world of managing uncertainty, doubt, anxious people, dependent people, where leadership really gets to be an art as well as a science. Then culture definers, this would be coaching CEOs and people who are actually defining a culture in their organizations. And then finally legacy creators, which I don't think I've ever really worked with anybody in this domain in a professional sense. Okay, I've got two definitions of executive coaching here. What is it? This is from the Forum Handbook, the Executive Coaching Forum Handbook. Executive coaching is an experiential and individualized leadership development process that builds a leader's capacity to reach short and long-term organizational goals. It's conducted through one-on-one interactions driven by data derived from multiple perspectives and based on mutual trust and respect. The organization, the executive, and the coach work in partnership to achieve maximum impact. Most of the coaching work that I do I'm hired by the company to work with the executive. Now, a lot of coaches actually are hired by the executive themselves. But when the organization and the executive are both involved, it's essentially you kind of have two clients. You're dealing with the organization as well as dealing with the executive. And this definition emphasizes that. Here's the second definition. It's a one-on-one confidential work with executives aimed at enhancing their current and future effectiveness. That is, developmental, not evaluative. Unconditional regard from the coach, so it's not evaluative. Focused on process, not technical or industry content, so it's not a McKinsey or a Bain or a Monitor. The company I work for, or I work with two companies now, But they're both small boutiques, and one is an international boutique that does only executive coaching at top-of-the-house coaching. So it's about process and not content. It's not therapy, and that's an important distinction. And the reason it's not therapy is because it's focused on a person in a role. I recently started with a client, not recently, 2 years ago, started with a young client at a university administration, not this university. She was a superstar and had been recruited to come across the country to work in her new role, and very young for the role, so they thought it'd be smart to hire a coach. And so she didn't choose it at all. She was told that she was going to come to the new job and meet her coach, which was I. And she said, "I don't get this. What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to talk about? What are you here for?" And then I told her a little bit about what I expected to happen, and she said, "Oh, I get it. It's therapy for my job." And I actually thought that that was a pretty good definition about what it is, but it is just for one's job. Okay, I'm going to give you a little history, how it developed. Executive coaching emerged really in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. It was part of management consulting interventions. You can just imagine if you're a management consulting firm and you go in and the companies ask you, how can I leverage my company, my investment here? It's not unusual that you would look at your people and say, well, this is your major investment and this is the major upside potential for improving business. So in the mid-90s, when things were just booming with the internet bubble, there was a wealth of resources and a very tight labor market. So it's when the sort of well-known Harvard Business School article entitled "The War for Talent" came out, and companies found that it was really much cheaper to develop their talent than it was to go find and keep hunting for talent. So the executive leadership, executive coach field came on the scene. The other side that was happening was that during managed care and the psychopharmacology advances, there were a lot of underemployed and underutilized clinicians out there who could easily transfer the developmental model that they were doing in clinical work to the business scene. So there was a rich number of people who were available to do it, and companies, when they tried coaching, found that they had a tremendous return on their investment. So there was also a lot of, in the 90s, there was a big sort of upside edge around computer applications of developmental tools, so that computer-based feedback model, the so-called 360 model. Do you all know what that is? 360 model is getting feedback for performance from the boss, the peers, and the direct reports, so that you get feedback from the entire surround of people who experience the effect or the impact of your performance. So because you could fill these forms out on the computer, you could get pretty interesting 360 feedback data for people, which was extremely valuable. And then also computer-based testing enabled us to have work profiles, personality profiles from larger numbers of people with feedback, so that was also valuable. So to pull this all together, the one-on-one counsel of a coach or a person who could help an executive integrate all this information came out of the Center for Creative Leadership, that sort of set the standard in the field for someone who could actually help you take all these sources of data and make sense out of them so that you can utilize them for your own development. On the supply side, coaching is really we're pretty much in the Wild West, or the frontier days of coaching. It's completely unregulated. There's an open marketplace of ideas and methods. If any of you think that you're interested in this kind of field, you're at a wonderful time in your life, chronologically, to be entering it. There's high creativity and innovation. People are trying everything. You're going to have some interesting speakers in this course who are doing things with the corporate athlete and energy and physical stuff, and artistic stuff, and it's just very, very wide open at this point. There's also, of course, equal opportunity for misapplication, misuse, and misplaced effort. Proliferation of resources, they're everywhere. Everybody's a coach. I don't know whether you're aware of this at your level, but if you go out into the business world, everybody has a coach. Everybody you run into is trying to be a coach, doing a little coaching, a little of this, a little of that. It's really very popular. There are beginning to be some rudiments of regulation, but there's no common definition, theory-based, qualifications, research, professional organization. It's all wide open. Now, on the demand side, from the executive's point of view, they love the idea of executive coaching because essentially these days, because the boom is over and the bubble burst, everybody's being expected to do more with less. The emerging global perspective is now putting tremendous pressure on executives because I really don't think we have a good way to do international business. It's puts enormous pressure on people who are traveling back and forth from continents and teams that are trying to communicate on the telephone. And so executive coaches or executives definitely need some help making decisions about how to manage people in that regard. There's heightened scrutiny and accountability. The same thing I was saying before, the scorecard, now that your performance review in most organizations at higher levels is enormously rich, robust, complicated information so that people have lots and lots of feedback about how they're doing. And they don't know exactly what to do with it all. They have poor work-life balance. People are working enormously long hours, many, many days, sometimes every day. And executive salaries are so high that people feel that somehow their lives, their time has already been bought. All this adds up to an enormous appetite for some reflective space, a relationship with somebody who can help you think about how you're going to get where you're going. And particularly someone who's outside the organization, somebody for whom you have no worries about them reporting back to your boss or to your those who evaluate your performance. Now, organizations are getting smart because they're starting to think about who's coaching in their organizations. Just imagine a big company like American Express. If the top 400, 800, 1,200 people all have coaches, it's very hard to regulate who's doing what standards are being set. And so we're getting some pushback in the coaching field about oversight. Issues of confidentiality are a little harder to hold. People want to know who you're seeing, how often, what the goals are, if the goals are being reached. And there's also a growing commoditization in the field, so that there's now you can get a coach online, or people can go to Coach You and sort of do only telephone coaching. So you can understand why companies are concerned. Okay, I want to give you a sense of what the when it's indicated, these are the top 10 from the boutique coaching firm that I work for. Somebody kept track of all the presenting problems, why people called us up asking for coaches. And you can see creating and leading a high-performing team is very high. Developing direct reports, holding people accountable, time management. These are all the qualities, the skills of leadership and management that you are going to be studying and thinking about in this course. How do people choose a coach? It's very important that you get a good fit. Obviously, it's a relationship, a one-to-one relationship of enormous trust. So there are people who want to have, there are all kinds of different executives, and they want different kinds of coaches. Some people like information and insight. Some people are, brash, tough, crusty people who want to be hit over the head, ask to have a professional nag. Other people like to see it as being given a gift, somebody who comes to visit them on a regular basis, talks to them on a regular basis, and helps them feel given to. That's only 3 of an infinite numbers of styles that you can think about for a coach. It's not uncommon when you're seeking a coach to meet with several different people, see what it feels like to be with them. And there is a proliferation now of authorizing organizations. There are 7,000 members now who belong to the International Coaching Federation. Regulation, here are just some of the logos of companies that are trying to market and develop businesses based on the coaching industry. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the way I work. And it's pretty hard, actually, to think about how I work. You know, when you do something most of your life, you develop talents and skills and styles and preferences that are pretty hard to articulate because they become tacit and not very easy to notice if it's you. But I tend to use these three concepts, and I think there are three concepts that you're going to hear much more about and read much more about in this course: authority, authenticity, and adaptive capacity. Authority is, you know, first of all, let's think about how important authority is. I mean, if you're a leader, you are leading people, they're depending on you, you have a followership. They are observing or engaged with your authority. And how they experience your authority will have everything to do with how well your enterprise goes, how well your campaign goes, how well your project goes. So we define authority as the right to do work. So, for example, if a cop pulls you over on the highway, most of us don't have too much trouble acknowledging their authority. We don't say, in whose authority do you work? It's pretty clear. On the other hand, if somebody comes up to you and says, your tire is low, your right tire needs to be repaired. Occasionally we might have who gave you the right to tell me that? What's your authority to tell me that? So the right to do work is usually conveyed formally with a role. So you get appointed to a role, you have certain privileges, certain authorization in your role. And there's also something called personal authority, or people who say they're self-authorized. And these are Larry Gould, who's a professor of leadership at CUNY, has this concept of personal authority developed, and he calls it the right to be, the right to take up your role. And when you think about the difference between management and leadership, if you want to move from management to leadership, you have to take some risks and try something new. And you often don't have the authority, the frank authority to do that. And great leaders will almost always tell you that they took up their own personal authority to do something different, to go against the grain. So it's a concept I use a lot. Now, there's a whole theory of authority called the Tavistock, or the group relations theory. And it was pioneered by a group in the UK at the Tavistock Institute in the mid-40s. It was actually came out after the Second World War, when, because of telecommunications, people were probably for the first time able to know pretty real time what was happening in different parts of the world. And also psychology had burst onto the scene in the 50s, and people had great hopes that we could take psychology and apply it to the study of groups and social systems in such a way that we could actually make the world a better place. So this work was pioneered by a man named Wilfred Bion, B-I-O-N, who tried to take what we know about psychology and psychoanalysis and what we knew about general systems theory and put it together in a way that we might be able to predict how large groups of people will behave under certain conditions. So the study of authority and leadership in both overt and covert manifestations is the topic of the group relations theorist. And I wrote a quotation here from Warren Bennis, who's one of my favorite leadership thinkers. And this is drawn from your reading for this course. But he says, as a nation, as organizations, and as individuals, we fear taking risks. The context of our work and personal lives reinforces a set of common values, attitudes, and perceptions that discourages us from standing out in a crowd, that calls for playing it safe. And of course, great leaders are not people who ever played it safe. Understanding this includes learning about the context that limits the full expression of leadership. This context is inherited from our youth and shapes our current view of ourselves. As long as it remains invisible to us, we cannot shift our thinking or our behavior to fill the leadership gap. So the study of authority actually leads us into places where we can see things that we could not see before, these covert processes. And authority is also traced back into history, which is also something that I think is very important if one is trying to develop leadership capacity. There's a lot of theory about the first organization, the first acts of leadership being in your first relationship. So here's a quote from, this is a book entitled Lost in Familiar Places, meaning that leaders get lost out there on the edge trying to lead something, but in fact where they're really lost is inside, in the familiarity of their internal theater. So individuals carry with them a model of organizational life that's derived from their early family experiences and their roles within the family. They learn customary ways of relating to authority, listening to the experiences of others, and collaborating around shared tasks. So it just makes sense, doesn't it? That the way you would take up doing a task outside the home has something to do with the way you observed it happening inside the home. Now, Freud argued that an individual responds to actual authority figures in his current life by transferring and projecting onto them the images of authority figures from the past, which he still carries in his mind. So one of my clients actually gave me this quote, which I think is really a wonderful one. He said, "Leaders are never as responsible as people think they are for the upside, and nor are they responsible for the failures." That what Freud said are these projections, these enormous hopes and projections, transferences onto leaders, create leaders actually, create the power of leadership, because we as dependent followers give leaders our authorization to take up their roles. And those patterns get started very early. And when you do coaching with leaders, it's very helpful to think about what their patterns are. We do a complete family history so that we actually know these, try to identify these constellations. Whoop. How do I get rid of that? Like that. Okay, the second day is authenticity, also something you're going to hear about in this class. A bit more of. The theorist that I depend on is Donald Winnicott, who's a clinician, a child psychiatrist, who talked about true self, false self identity. He's responsible for the concept of the holding environment and the transitional object. These are those of you who've done any studying about development in psychology would have heard of these topics, but true self is the real self. False self gets started in the first relationship, when there's a lot of pressure to be somebody and behave in certain ways that take a lot of effort, that are not really true to oneself. So if you had a parent who wanted you to be, to make them, to reflect positively on them, to be a good child, to learn how to speak early, to learn how to perform early, what children do is they out of love, they comply and they create these certain behaviors that will please their parents. But necessarily what happens is that the true self is set aside and the false self is developed. And it's impossible to follow a leader, I believe, to truly follow a leader you don't trust to be real. So authenticity has a great deal to do with leadership. And it's often helpful to think about what the early messages were about one's false self. Because, of course, we all have it. We can't avoid it. I mean, parents want us to do things, we have to learn and grow and survive in a world, and parents have to teach us how to do that. So it's a certain kind of give and take around this. But it's very helpful because people who want to climb the corporate ladder, of course, are very busy coming across with the right behaviors. So how do you balance authenticity with performance? which actually brought me back to this poem that you've been using here in this class. It's Yeats' poem about the falconer and the falcon, which again, if you have a falconer who's expecting you to do things and fly to places that are not easy for you and are definitely stretches, then the false self can get stretched too far, and then the center doesn't hold. Okay, adaptive capacity is the last A, and I think that as we become a more complicated technological knowledge worker-based country of workers, we need to be more adaptive. There are fewer managers and more leaders, and so adaptation is definitely called for. The model I like to use is Ron Heifetz's model, which very simply stated is the steps of getting on the balcony, identifying the adaptive challenge, regulating distress, maintaining disciplined action, giving the work back to the stakeholders, the people who really care about whether the work is getting done, and protecting the voices of leadership beneath you. Okay, now let's shift gears to the process of executive coaching. It's pretty, most coaches are settling on this process. It's becoming a standard in the field. Contracting, data gathering, delivering feedback, development planning, coaching, and evaluating. I'm going to go through each of these. The 360 verbatim feedback and the pursuit of congruence is exactly where coaching is going these days. This is a quote from Robert Burns that talks about, oh, what some power the gifted give us to see ourselves as others see us. So there's lots of data now that shows that if there's congruence between the way we see ourselves and the way others see us, we're going to be more successful in our work endeavors. I think it has, it probably has something to do with trust. It probably has something to do with how well you read and can predict what you can and cannot do in a certain situation. So what we do in coaching is we collect data from the surround, the boss, peers, direct reports, most often the spouse, and when we can, when the budget permits, we do parents and children and friends. So we get a holistic picture of who the client is. This promotes self-awareness, builds rapport, and creates motivation for change. The way it builds rapport is that because we do verbatim feedback, and what I do is when I do an interview, I'll go and literally type exactly what my interviewee is saying, and then compile a document, which I'll show you, with direct quotes on it. And in doing so, I become a fellow traveler with my client, so that. Should I hit the button again, Barry? Twice. Okay. So I become a fellow traveler with my client, and we get a document that looks something like this. So here's a sample document from a guy named Tom. So we're asking, what are Tom's greatest strengths as a contributor to Meridian? This is just a mock-up compilation of different people's feedback. It's well-protected confidentiality. But we put down what Tom said about what his greatest strengths are, what the CEO said, what the peers said. So following down here, there are several peers. And then what the direct reports said. So what we get is a surround. Now, there's another document that I didn't copy, a separate document that has the family data in it, but we ask the same questions. So we can see the parallels between what the workplace sees as the executive strengths and what the family and friends see as the executive strengths. And, often they're very, very closely aligned. We back? Okay, good. Okay, so it builds rapport because the executive reads all this stuff together with me. When I do the interviews, I sometimes have assistants who help me with the interviews. And so I never read all the interviews until I'm literally sitting with the client. And so the client can turn to me, we're shoulder to shoulder, and say, oh my goodness, is this something you could help me with? So rather than me bringing him or her the news of what the community thinks of their leadership, I'm in fact noticing it along with them, and so we become partners in change rather than me leading the way. So the contracting is simply, it's sort of a business tactic of making sure that you do a good assessment, you hear their story, you ask questions, you present the options, and then you create some sort of pathway forward. Then we do the data collection, and it's very important what information we gather. So here's another list of the questions that we ask. And it's a very, very detailed, this is the product that we use because it's top of the house and people are very curious about their performance. We do a very, very detailed questionnaire. So each of these questions are asked of the 10 or 12 people in the study. And we get a verbatim document that usually is perhaps 100 pages long of quotations for each of these questions. So here are the leadership qualities that you all have read a little bit about in your around traits. And then we do relationships with the direct reports. So we would ask things like, broad brush, how would you describe those relationships? How effectively does the team function as a team? How clearly do her direct reports know what she expects of them? How does she hold them accountable? How effectively does she coach and develop her people? So we go through, the interviews usually take about an hour, and we probe. What's nice about doing them live is that you have the opportunity, if somebody says, if you say, how good a listener is she? And the person thinks for a while and says, pretty good. We know enough, we're on a questionnaire, an online questionnaire, you wouldn't necessarily get an answer to that. We would say, gee, you paused there. I'm wondering why. And then the interviewee might say, well, she really doesn't listen at all. So then we start to get the real data, which is very helpful for having a live person do the interview. So there are questions about relationships with superiors, integrity and congruence, which is a very big factor in leadership. The emotional competence, which is the sort of EQ, the things that Daniel Goleman is writing about. How openly and appropriately does she reveal both positive and negative feelings? Does she have a sense of humor? Can she laugh at himself? That should be her. How does she react to criticism? How well does she balance her personal life with her work life? And then we do a wrap-up at the end about current effectiveness in the future. And we ask literally, do you think he's in the right job? And if not, why not? And what are her career aspirations? What do you think really motivates him? What do you think the future holds for him? What would she like to be remembered for? So you begin to get a really deep picture of how this executive is seen. And the executive hears what people really think, where people think they're going in their life, and what their potential for reaching their goals is in that organization. And at the end, can you see this? What do you think you could do to help? Which then turns the interview into an intervention of sorts. Okay, that's the document reader, right? Here we go. Okay, so these are the things that we look at. These are the people that we talk to. This is how we gather. We gather it verbatim. It's anonymous. So the client is quoted, the boss is quoted, but the peers and direct reports are anonymous. And when I'm collecting the data or my colleagues are collecting the data, if somebody says something that flags who they are, we ask them to change it, to recraft the sentence, and then we read it again before we compile the document so that people can really be assured that they're giving anonymous and detailed data. And also, the only way that we can do this in an organization is if we guarantee that the client that the data belongs to the client. That is, that we show it to no one else, and if the boss sees it, if anyone sees it, it's only through the client. They're the gatekeeper of all the information. So the feedback session is usually a day or two at an offsite. The coach is, as I said, a partner in change, not a driver of change. And it's a reflective space. And I showed you the example. After we do the feedback session, which is often a very powerful event, I think it's almost, some people would say, transformative, we do the development planning. And we ask the executive, what do they want to do to change? What sort of aspects of their leadership do they want to leverage? And we ask them to be very specific and use SMART goals. And I have a sample development plan for you here. We ask the executive to write a vision statement of the leader that they want to become. And here's one. Can I zoom out on this? Yeah. Okay. Can you read that? Do you want me to read it to you? This is the executive that I gave you some data about his strengths before. It's the vision he wrote. I want to be regarded as a skilled, passionate, and committed leader with high standards and a high drive to win. Others will say that I balance successful business results with an empathic appreciation for people and process, including always treating others with respect. I want to be known as someone who can juggle multiple and complex work initiatives in a focused and organized way. I would like to convey that I'm clear about my priorities and that I delegate responsibility well to my capable and trusted staff. People will want to work for me because I select my staff carefully, give them significant responsibility, and provide the guidance and coaching they need to develop and grow in their roles. So this was particularly from an executive who was dinged for not developing his people and for not managing his priorities well. So after reading the feedback data, he became focused on what the upside potential and what his aspiration was. And this is what the development plan looked like. So there were 3 or 4 goals in this particular development plan, but the first was to prioritize my responsibilities and focus my time and energy exclusively on those priorities. So manage my time in a respectful manner. So you can see how very detailed. Then we have 6 months of coaching, usually, is sold, intense coaching. And then we measure progress with the spot check, which means that we go back to the same interview pool and we ask them how the executive has changed. And we start out by saying, have you seen any changes in the last 6 months? And then we go over each development goal and ask specifically about change on a -3, 0, +3 rating. Of course, the critical period here is what happens right here after the development plan and as you begin the coaching. And that's where real coaching talent, skill, persistence comes in. And that's where the coaching relationship comes into play. So aspects of that relationship are unconditional positive regard for the true self, containment, a holding environment, abiding over time, big picture perspective, contractual safety, and a developmental medium. And that is, no matter what the medium that the client's talking to me in, I both empathically reflect that, but also anticipate the next level. So if you think about trying to help an executive develop, we have these 4 stages of development that are all cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. So your first stage is unconscious competence. That's what, when the executive reads the 360 feedback, he or she notices that they have a incompetence that they're not even aware of. And so it becomes conscious. Oh, I didn't know that I was not showing respect for it by juggling my priorities. And then it becomes a conscious incompetence. And then with coaching, it then becomes consciously competent because you're trying really hard, taking good notice of what you're doing. And then eventually it it leads to an unconscious competence. Okay. I want to ask you, in terms of authority, there was one last question I had that I wanted to ask you, and that was, do you know this actors workshop show that's on TV where people interview actors and ask them questions? Are you familiar with that? I'm not a TV watcher, but my friends told me about this, which is prelude to the next question. Evidently, one of the favorite questions on there was, if there is a God, if there is a heaven and you get there, what do you want God to say? Have you heard this question? Take a minute and just on the corner of your notes, write down your first reaction to this question. If there is a heaven and you get there, what do you want God to say? Is anybody brave enough to share your answer? Come on in. Welcome. That's a good one. What about some others? What? Wait a minute? You're the man. You're the man. Okay. Yep, you're the man. So welcome. Come on in. You're the man. Any others? That's right. What are you doing here? You don't belong here. Any others? Well done. Good job. Well done. Anybody else have anything different? We're sort of covering the territory now. Any others?
Thank God you're here.
Thank God you're here. I'm glad. So if you think about this, what we're talking about is our inner authority. What authority we carry within ourselves. So these are the authorities that you're attempting to please as you go about your life. The best answer I've heard yet, and maybe you'll come up with some better ones if you think about it, is Anthony Quinn, who evidently said, he thought about it for a minute, and he said, this is what God would say: Tony, I understand. So if you think about this projected authority figure, are they asking what kind of job you're doing? Are they looking for companionship? Are they offering understanding? These are the important aspects that you yourself carry with you as you go to take up the leadership of your own life and the enterprises that you deem worthy. So, good luck. Thank you very much.